All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are looking at one of the most intense and honestly roller coaster decades in Kenya's recent history. We're talking about the period from 2002 to 2011, a time that started with so much optimism but ended up testing the very soul of the nation.
This quote, wow, it's actually the title of the chapter we're drawing from in Daniel Branch's History of Kenya, and it just perfectly sets the stage. It's a story that kicks off with this massive wave of hope for a totally new beginning, but, well, it lands with this sobering thought that sometimes the more things seem to change, the more they really stay the same. So, let's rewind to 2002. You have to picture the scene. The feeling in the air was just electric. For millions of Kenyans, the election that year wasn't just another vote. No, this felt like a second independence. Now, to really get that feeling of hope, you got to understand what came before it. For almost a quarter of a century, Kenya had been run by one man and one party. People were just tired. They were desperate for a clean break from the corruption and the political clampdowns that had defined those years.
And that break seemed to show up in the form of the National Rainbow Coalition, or NARC for short. I mean, this was the perfect recipe for hope, right? You had this big, multi-ethnic group led by Kibaki, and their promises, they were huge. A brand new constitution driven by the people in just 100 days, and a total war on corruption. The result? A complete landslide. It really felt like a new day for Kenya.
But you know how it goes. Once the parties and the celebrations died down, a pretty tough reality started to sink in. This new government, the one that held so much promise, started to look, well, a lot like the old one. That dream of a new Kenya, it was starting to fray at the edges.
And things came apart shockingly fast. First, that 100-day deadline for a new constitution, it just came and went. Nothing. Then the Anglo leasing scandal hit, a huge corruption scheme that went right to the top of the new government. The guy they hired to fight corruption, John Githongo, ended up exposing the whole thing from the inside before he had to flee the country for his own safety. By 2005, that Rainbow Coalition had completely fallen apart. The hope was gone, and in its place was that old, familiar feeling of being let down.
So by the time 2007 rolled around, all of that frustration and disappointment had basically created a political powder keg. In the election that year, it was going to be the match that lit the fuse.
The stakes just could not have been higher. The whole political contest got super polarized, split right down ethnic lines. It tapped into these really old grievances about land and power and who gets what, stuff that had been simmering just below the surface for decades. See, the election wasn't just about who'd be president. It was about which community's turn it was to eat, and that's a Kenyan political term for who gets to control and benefit from the country's resources.
So Election Day happens, and it's followed by days of just utter confusion and delayed results. When the announcement finally comes, the incumbent, Kibaki, is declared the winner, but the opposition, led by Raila Odinga, immediately cried foul. They pointed to what looked like blatant rigging and claimed that they had actually won. Suddenly, you had two men both claiming to be the president of Kenya.
And instead of hitting pause to sort out this massive crisis, Kibaki was quickly sworn in at dusk, in this rush ceremony that was broadcast on state TV. For so many Kenyans watching at home, that single act confirmed their absolute worst fears. The election had been stolen.
The reaction was immediate, and it was devastating. What started as protests against the election result just exploded into horrific, ethnically charged violence. And this wasn't random chaos. It was often organized, with people being targeted just because of their ethnic identity. It reignited all these bitter, historical fights over land. Kenya, which had always been seen as the stable country in a really volatile region, was literally tearing itself apart.
In just a few weeks, more than 1,100 people were killed.
And over 600,000 were forced from their homes, basically becoming refugees in their own country. The human cost was just staggering.
As the country was staring down into this abyss, the international community was scrambling, just desperate to pull Kenya back from the brink of a full-blown civil war.
So in comes this high-profile team led by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. They started this incredibly difficult process of just trying to get the two sides to talk to each other, even while the violence was still going on.
After weeks of really tense negotiations, they finally got a breakthrough. It was called the National Accord, and what it did was create this power-sharing government, a grand coalition, with Kibaki staying as president, but a new job, prime minister, was created for Raila Odinga. It was a practical solution to stop the killing, sure, but it also kind of reinforced this idea that political power is just a prize for the elites to divide up among themselves.
But what about justice for all the victims? The peace deal called for accountability.
But when Kenya's own politicians couldn't agree on setting up a local court to try the people responsible for the violence, the whole process was handed over to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, in The Hague.
So the ICC indicted 6 really high-profile Kenyans. And this included 2 men who, and this is a wild twist of fate, would later become the country's next president and deputy president, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. So this intervention, which was meant to bring justice, ironically ended up totally reshaping the country's politics for years to come.
Okay, so after all that, the hope, the crisis, the messy peace deal, what's the big lesson from this traumatic decade? What was actually left after the fire?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the excitement of 2002 was based on a bit of a flawed idea, that if you just change the people at the top, the whole country will change with them. This decade proved that the political system itself, a system built on ethnic loyalties and the zero-sum fight for resources, was way more powerful. Just swapping one set of leaders for another didn't change the fundamental rules of the game.
And this quote from John Githongo, when he came back from exile in 2008, just nails the mood perfectly. The idealism was gone. It was replaced by this tough, clear-eyed realism. The dream of a perfect, brand-new Kenya was over. The job now was to figure out how to work with the imperfect one they actually had.
And that leaves us with a really fundamental question, not just for Kenya, but for any country that's trying to change. How much is really decided by the vision of a few leaders, and how much is just trapped by the deep-rooted systems they inherit? Kenya's turbulent decade of hope and despair suggests that, well, the answer is anything but simple.